Hello, everyone. Do you hear me now? So I want to welcome you all to Long Nights of Interculturality 2020 panel discussion, media and reporting COVID-19. I'm very grateful for all the panelists that are here with us today. And I would like to introduce our Honorary Ambassador, Mr. Farid Dik, who's going to lead the discussion today. And we are all very looking forward to hearing your insights into media, over-reporting, how can balance be found between media responsibility and media freedom. So, thank you.
Thank you for your introduction. I'm Farid Diek. I'm from Monterrey, Mexico. It's an honor for me to be an ambassador of ICDO for this and all their projects. Right now, I'm going to be the moderator of this panel, this discussion panel, and I'm going to start by introducing a little bit about our guests, our speakers. We have Dr. Silvio Waisbord. He's director and professor in the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University and the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Press Politics. Please say hi, Dr. Silvio.
You're Hello. There.
Okay, thank you. We have also Dr. Bradley Wiggins. He's a professor and head of the Department of Media and Communications at Webster Vienna Private University. Bradley, say hi, please.
Grüß Gott. Hello.
We also have Mr. Scott Griffen. He's the deputy director at the International Press Institute. Please say
Hello.
hi, Scott. Thank
Hello.
you. And finally, we have also Mr. Dragan Maga. He's regional manager of Infobip.
Hello, dobar dan.
Thank you very much. Well, to start the discussion, we know that globally the media had a great impact in spreading the news to the public about COVID-19. So to start the conversation, I will ask all panelists to briefly reflect generally on what has been the role of the media in the time of COVID-19. Participants can answer in any order, so please just raise your hand or anything and then talk, please. Who wants to start?
I can go first.
Okay, go.
So thank you very much for the invitation. Just one minor point of clarification. I used to be the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Press and Politics. I'm no longer that. I'm still the director I'm professor of the School of Media at George Washington University. So on your question, I think that in some ways what has happened during the last 6-7 months is that the media role has been sort of unprecedented in terms of making the pandemic sort of global news. And of course, the pandemic has affected virtually every life around the world. So the pandemic is not just a media event, but it has also been a media event, given the phenomenal attention that the media generally has paid to the pandemics for very obvious reasons. It has been unprecedented news. It's very difficult to think about any form of global news that has such sustainability in time as the pandemic. What is also interesting is that the interest in global news about the pandemic sort of peaked in the early months of 2020, and eventually it diminished. Not the media interest, but the public interest. So, for example, if you go to some search engines and look at interest in COVID-19 or pandemic news, what we have is sort of a spike in the interest, particularly in March and April, and then you have a curve down and then sort of more flattened interest. So I would say that in general, the media has been sort of an intrinsic part of the pandemic, and we can elaborate later. There have been exceptional great moments of news coverage of the pandemic, as well as really bad moments of journalism and the way that the media has approached the pandemic. We can go and talk this further.
Thank you very much, Silvio. Anyone else wants to compliment? Please, Bradley.
Thank you, Silvio, for your take. I want to offer maybe a slightly different view. I agree with everything you said, but I was thinking about this question and I was reminded, it's not entirely connected to COVID, but I will bring it back to that. Back in 2016, when the Trump campaign was in full swing and gaining speed, the former CEO of CBS, Les Moonves, said, and I'm quoting, "Man, who would have expected the ride we're all having right now? This is pretty amazing. Who would have thought that this circus would come to town? But, you know, it may not be good for America. It's damn good for CBS." That's all I got to say. The money's rolling in and this is fun. And, you know, what my point in bringing that up here is, in order to consider the role of the media in any crisis, any time, I hate to be the one to do it, but we have to remember it's always going to have a profit-driven model. And I mean, I know this is obvious, but it, you know, when people like to point at Facebook or whatever platform and blame it for spreading fake news or whatever, I think we tend to forget that individuals are involved in that process as well. I know we'll get to that later, but you know, I think that news journalism, investigative news journalism, is challenged by social media giants, be it Facebook, be it TikTok, because it's so much easier to share something that's easily repeatable. It's like a bag of chips. You just keep eating more and more, as opposed to, say, reading Bob Woodward's latest book, Rage, right? I mean, it takes time and effort to read real, proper journalism, as opposed to swipe, swipe, swipe. You know, so I think that's a problem. Whether we can debate about the role of the media, but if the economic model is going to change, which would be an interesting debate in and of itself, then I think we could talk about the role of media in terms of maybe a desired or an ideal outcome.
Thank you very much, Dr. Badley. A very interesting insight. Anyone else? Maybe Scott or Dragan? Dragan, please.
Yeah, Farid, thank you. Also, thanks for the invitation and slight correction as well. I used to be a regional manager. Now it's sales consultant part. But I would reflect on maybe experience from different angle and maybe from creation perspective. First, I think media played mostly positive role. On one side, COVID-19 created huge opportunity for media. Because of social distancing, everybody is spending time at home. So this led to spike in media consumption. So all types of media profited from that part. On the other side, COVID-19 was a huge disruption for every industry, including media. And on top of other challenges that media had, like declining revenue from advertising, rise of social media, shift to mobile consumption, and even different expectation and behavior of new generation. So this all created sort of a combination of factors which are not helping media to deliver what is expected. And what I guess everybody expected is to get clear, confirmed, and trustworthy information in order to understand what's going on in this particular situation. So it was the same in Croatia. Government adopted lockdown, everything stopped. So obviously everybody turned to media to understand what's going on in the world. So I think at the beginning, media created great atmosphere and helped healthcare and government to put crisis under control. But later on, when more information came and new publishing went in scientific magazines, there were more dissonant tones. Some of the questions started to get questioned, and I guess it's pretty much the same everywhere. So I think it's also very normal. The more you know about something, the more you challenge the status quo.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dragan. Mr. Scott, please.
Hello everybody, and maybe just from our point of view, the International Press Institute is a press freedom organization, so obviously we're looking at this issue from that perspective. But for us, I think there are a couple of key roles that the media are playing or should be playing in this crisis. So I'll just say a little bit about that briefly. The first is obviously the need to provide information about the public health crisis itself. And that's obviously an extremely valuable role. And I think there's little doubt that one of the original sins of the pandemic was, we saw the repression of free expression and whistleblowers and media in China, which prevented the world from understanding, what we were planning to face. So this is obviously one point. And the second point is providing a platform for debating the efficacy and appropriateness of different responses to the pandemic. It's a brand new situation, and the media are obviously the place where that debate can take place. And the third thing I think is that the pandemic is also, this is obviously an exceptional situation. We've seen the biggest rollback in civil liberties in generations. But obviously, which is something that the media need to have a very close eye on as well. What are going to be the long-term impacts of everything that we've seen in the lockdowns? But also, and we also know this is a big opportunity as well for new types of corruption. If you look at the massive amounts of procurement of different medical supplies, so the watchdog role of the media, this also is a huge factor, or should be a huge factor. So there are a number of very critical roles that the media need to be playing in this pandemic. Whether that is the case is a separate question. But from our point of view, this is why we have put so much emphasis on tracking attacks on the press, because we understand how important the media's role is. And I just wanted to make one point. The previous speaker was made about the spike in media consumption. In fact, I think that's been one of the biggest ironies about the pandemic in terms of the media, is that yes, people need more information than ever, but the media has never been under more financial pressure than ever, partly as a result of the pandemic. We've heard from many editors say that every day is basically election day in terms of the amount of traffic coming to, in particular, news websites, and yet at the same time, advertising revenue has collapsed. And growth in subscription is in most cases not enough to keep up with the need. So this is we have actually a huge crisis at the moment in terms of the financial landscape for media, and that has a knock-on impact, of course, on the media's ability to play all of these roles.
Thank you very much, Scott. Dr. Silvio, I want to ask you a pair of questions. First, one of the questions you raised in one of your last articles is, how do we solve misinformation in a new regime of truths? Could you describe what you will propose? How can the media provide accurate and authentic information on COVID, while also, at the same time, preventing panic and fostering public cooperation with prevention measures?
Thank you. So the situation right now is that there is a phenomenal amount of freedom of expression in so many ways, in spite of the restrictions that were mentioned earlier, which are sort of noticeable in a variety of ways in many countries. But it's sort of the mainstreaming of all kinds of opinions, particularly in relation to the pandemic. And what we have seen is a proliferation of false information, misinformation, disinformation, that in some ways is a continuation of the trends that we have seen in the last years. It's not new, but what is remarkable is how important that has been during the pandemic. So in some ways you have almost like equal competition of information produced that has been checked, that is factual information, that is grounded on scientific evidence. What is information coming from journalism, or information coming from public health experts, and at the same time, side by side, with information that doesn't meet any of these requirements. And this is the brave new world in which we have been for a while, and the pandemic has revealed in how problematic it is. So the pandemic, as we know, has shown all the problems that we have in our societies, but also particularly the problems that we have in our information ecology, which is how you can have disinformation and information competing at the same time. And oftentimes disinformation or misinformation actually prevail. with all the mix of conspiracy theories and information that is never grounded better by any expert. Given the situation, and back to your question, I think that there are no clear answers. What do we need to do about this? There are multiple responsibilities for the situation. I don't think that we can go back to a time, and probably we should not go back to a time, because we live in a time of information abundance. So all these dystopian processes of disinformation and misinformation are expected when you have more information made available, particularly on the internet. And we can discuss in details, but I remain skeptical that all the solutions, all the options that have been discussed for the last, particularly 4 years, actually are sufficient. And actually, as a global society, we don't have good options, particularly given what we mentioned earlier. The fundamental crisis of journalism, which is a financial and economic crisis, an employment crisis, the crisis of the labor conditions for journalists pretty much around the world. And that has been one of the few institutions, resources that democracies have to counter disinformation. So we are countering disinformation with very minimal resources. But even if we had better resources, it's not clear that information necessarily will prevail over the forces of disinformation that deliberately disseminate information that has nothing to do with what actually happens in reality. And that, to me, is the main challenge that the pandemic has sort of revealed for all of us.
Thank you very much, Dr. Silvio. Another fast question is that since we have observed that in countries such as Mexico and Bolivia, or in poorer countries, it is very difficult for marginalized and economically weak communities to follow preventative measures such as buying masks and hand sanitizer, or even keeping a social distance, right? Can we say that the World Health Organization guidelines, which are focused mostly on rich or developed countries, or those preventative measures being promoted by the media, are culturally insensitive?
Great question. I think that the recommendations by the WHO are based on scientific, epidemiological, public health considerations. The question is then, how is it that different actors, particularly governments, may take those recommendations and make sensible policies that on the one hand are respectful and mindful of what the experts said about how to control the pandemic. But governments need to weigh in all kinds of other considerations, from economic considerations, the situation of the health system, to the cultural issues that you just mentioned. And unfortunately, I think that we have been seeing huge failures in this regard. So it's not just blindly following what the WHO has been saying, but basically how you integrate WHO guidelines in very complex situations in terms of access to jobs, access to health services, access to information services. These all set of questions that typically are not part of the way that WHO does, because fundamentally it's a health organization, right? So it has been incumbent upon governments and other actors, including civil society organizations, how you come up with sensible, efficient responses, considering a variety of factors that are widely different across the world.
Thank you very much, Dr. Silvio. Mr. Dragan, we see that the steps are being taken by online media platforms such as algorithms to detect false information involving journalists, to detect the myths or disinformation, advertising policies, etc., to ensure media freedom while avoiding unnecessary panic amongst the public. So I want to start by asking you, how can communication technology improve access to information, especially in communities in which live in remote areas and do not have proper access to health institutions? For example, Maya community in Mexico, to reduce false health information, or in general to help them to timely receive health information?
Great question. So generally, I think communication technology, they enable new innovative solutions. For example, in this case, telemedicine or remote health. And it's a great answer for problem where traditional solutions don't exist or it's inadequate. So in our case, I use the opportunity to also say something about our company and what we do. So we basically offer solution which completely fits and solves such challenges. We are a global cloud communication platform, and we enable businesses to interact with their customers, users, any type of interactions. And basically, our mission is to provide accessible and safe and innovative communication for different geographies, different industries, and enable them to grow, to innovate, but also to make their community a better place. So to be concrete, for example, in Maya community in Mexico, what we could do and what we are doing in similar situation, we could empower local health provider or health platform to offer access to medical services remotely. As well, our partner could be NGO who is solving some particular global challenge, like helping indigenous communities. And what we are actually doing, we are ensuring for the user to consume the service, and they need only to have mobile device. It could be smartphone or even plain phone and a signal. So if they have a smartphone, they could have a rich experience. For example, we could build chatbot speaking Mayan language, which could be deployed on chat app they're using, like Facebook Messenger or WhatsApp or Viber, and they could get instant information. Maybe they could check whether they have symptoms of disease without having ability or having the need to visit a doctor. So we could provide this solution remotely at very friction of cost. If the user doesn't have a smartphone, has normal phone, plain phone, everything works on SMS as well. And we know everybody uses SMS, and actually SMS could be delivered text message to any type of device. So basically what we are offering is low barrier interactive solution which solves the problem. And in this case, it's remote medical assistance. And I think this is the great value we are producing here.
Mr. Dragan, can we use media technologies flexibility and widespread availability to enhance public adherence to the safety measures recommended by global health organizations to combat the spread of the COVID-19? What precautions should be necessary in this regard?
Simple answer, yes. We could use technology, flexibility, and availability for such actions. And I think, especially during this crisis, traditional media, print and broadcast, they remain the most trusted sources of information for general public, despite the rise of social media. Still, the majority of population turn to traditional media to get the real information, I would say like this. What also we do, then I think it's really good example how technology help governments and public sector. During this pandemic, we engaged with around 50 public and governmental institutions across the globe, and we offer free of charge, 100% free of charge access to our technology and solutions in order to deliver trusted, real-time interactive information for public health institutions in different areas, in Africa, in APAC, India, Europe, Latin America. And we understood that providing critical information and answering important questions helps keep people safe, especially during pandemics. In terms of precautions, I would say in terms of technology, it's definitely ensuring the capacity and capability of communication technology to deliver the potentially massive volume of interactions, calls, contacts. More bigger precaution, I would say, is obviously to ensure the information is confirmed, it's trustworthy, it's not fake news, obviously. But in our case, as we were dealing with public institution, we kind of rely on them to do that, and I think this was not questioned at any time.
Thank you very much, Dragan. Dr. Bradley, humor and are an effective way of engaging the audience? And what's your opinion? How has it affected the news on COVID-19?
Could you please repeat the question? It was quite cut off for me. I didn't. I just heard affected the news on COVID-19.
All right, I'm gonna. Don't worry. What I said is that, do you think that memes, satire, humor are an effective way of engaging the audience? And in your opinion, how has it affected the news on COVID-19?
Is it effective? Absolutely. I mean, I just finished a study on rather a far right group that uses memes in the United States to promote their white supremacist gun rights, so-called gun rights ideology. They use the hashtag Boogaloo or Civil War II. The point, though, is yes, but for what purpose? It's engaging for what purpose? And whenever my students, for example, ask me this question, because it comes up sometimes, they're often confused because they think that memes are necessarily always about making a joke and then that's it. Humor is the entry point, and you know, the person who would tag a meme with hashtag #MeToo but has a humorous component in it might not laugh at the person who adds a hashtag with some kind of white supremacist, conspiratorially minded kind of notion. So it's complicated, but when you're talking about COVID, there are a couple of points that I'd like to make. It seems that humor has a precise function with the COVID memes, satire, fake news, and the function is a little different, right? So first of all, on the one hand, with individuals groups who would share a kind of conspiratorial discourse or a conspiratorial way of understanding reality, that yes, of course, COVID was engineered by Bill Gates to put chips in all of us, right? This is one popular theme. The use of humor is done almost violently. It's very aggressive. It's deeply antagonistic against other. Other in this case is anyone who opposes them, anyone who disagrees with Trump, etc. You see the pattern. On the other side, the people who are social distancing, wearing masks, who get it, who understand this is a pandemic. Humor also plays a role, but it's one that kind of it doesn't delegitimize like the other category. It's more about conveying the message that this is tough. These are tough times. Let's have a bit of a laugh. Let's share some content that invariably reinforces the message that we should wear masks. Maybe we're making fun of it, but it's not a searing critique. It's not mocking. It's not delegitimizing another group. There's this odd sort of almost kind of a polarized imbalance between the two discourses. At least I see them. I don't know if there's only just two discourses, but it seems like there's an emergent one, a so-called anti-masker. It's a sort of a version of the anti-vaccination movement that Trump largely really helps to fuel with his various kind of quixotic conspiratorial thinking and rhetoric, which is taken up by his followers and supporters. But to go back to the question of how it affects the news, it's been my contention for some time that there is something that I've tried to define it as concretely as possible, called a media narrative. And I think most people, especially journalists, have an understanding of what media narrative is. It's different though when you're teaching in college. students don't always understand that a media narrative is a construction. It's a construction of reality, essentially. You're making conscious choices about which words to use, which images to include or not, right? Now, when that news event is encapsulated in image form as a meme, easily shared, easily tweeted, TikToked or whatever, it's just a little glimpse of that media narrative. It can be used rather insidiously to support a particular ideological practice, whether it's to further a kind of paranoid conspiratorial delusion, or whether it's let's just make fun of the situation. It's tough these times. You know, it's this very strange bifurcation of meaning. You have the very clear dual sides of the discourse, as how I see it thus far.
And do you think that do social media provide support for or grounds for misinformation and discrimination? Or how can cultural sensitivity be protected in such a case? Or I don't know, do you think that algorithms are effective in curbing hatred, or are they any other, or are there any other ways to do that better? I don't know, such as should social media platforms be left to be regulated by themselves, or should third parties be involved with the role of policing? What do you think about this?
Sure. Just a brief historical note. I think it was back in 1996, a man by the name of John Perry Barlow. He was a lyricist for the Grateful Dead. He penned something called the Declaration for the Independence of Cyberspace, I believe. And it was a very California utopian view of the internet. And a lot of that was carried forward by people like Clay Shirky and even Henry Jenkins and others, that simply by using social media, you're going to have a kind of the use itself leads to a positive social good, which is, of course, as of post-Brexit, post-Trump electoral victory, etc., fake news, alternative facts, we see this, of course, not the case. But in terms of your question, in terms of algorithms, so I take the view that they're somewhat neutral. I mean, I'm sure there might be some disagreement about that, because I take it that they're somewhat neutral because the groups who use social media to gather for Black Lives Matter, for Me Too, for gay marriage, they're just as able to have a demonstration, have some kind of public presence, online presence, just as well as social media can be used in Poland as it is currently to identify LGBT for nefarious purposes. Just as the same way that Facebook's Free Basics program was used in Myanmar to target the Rohingya minority. And there are other instances where social media, I'm sorry, but they can use it for really quite almost genocidal kind of outcomes, and directed at women, directed at minorities, directed at any group that a majoritarian group views as other. And they can corral this group through social media. And, it's as if the media platform itself isn't really, we tend to maybe ascribe a kind of human agency to it, but we forget that there are human beings involved in the sharing, the curating, and the tweeting, and everything. So it's a bit complicated, right? And it gives me concern. I do think that regulation, possibly even a breakup, break up the social media giants probably would be a good solution. I don't know that we'll ever get there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bradley. Mr. Scott, how important is the role of professional journalism to discredit disinformation or debunking fake news, and what is the risk of amplifying fake news in the process?
Thanks. First, maybe just wanted to back up 1 minute and say a little bit more about what IPI has been doing during the pandemic. We've been basically tracking attacks on the press globally since the beginning of March. Looking at, we've had, I think, around 450 different incidents of of attacks on press freedom, which range from physical attacks on journalists, covering public health measures, to restrictions on access to information. So we see in many states have either stopped processing FOI requests or prevent journalists from speaking with healthcare workers, for example. And we also see numerous examples of laws, new laws being created, especially sort of so-called fake news laws, which essentially criminalize any type of reporting that contradicts a state narrative. We saw this type of thing in Russia, but also in Southeast Asia, and of course in Hungary, and in general, sort of prosecutions and arrests of journalists, again, who are reporting critically on the government's response to the pandemic. I think in India that we recorded close to 60 criminal prosecutions of journalists. So from the beginning, there was, especially in the early stages of the pandemic, a sort of knee-jerk reaction of states to try to control the narrative around the pandemic, which I think reflects that there was a lot at stake in many different ways. Obviously, a health crisis, but also an economic crisis. And as I said before, there are so many important roles that the media are playing, and that is why we put so much effort into tracking these violations. Because we really feel that this is a moment where we need critical independent media coverage more than ever. I think we all expect there to be many long-term changes coming out of this pandemic, and this is the time to be looking at those and debating those. Not least because, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of money at stake as well, and this is where you really need watchdog journalism to be looking into all of these things. Your specific question about the role of professional journalism to discredit disinformation, yes, it's absolutely essential, and that is also where we would put the emphasis on combating fake news, is to support independent journalism, and in order to do so, obviously the first thing is that you need to ensure that media are free to do their jobs. And as I said before, this was a serious issue at the beginning of the pandemic, and it still is. And the other thing is, these media, as I mentioned at the very beginning, media themselves are in a massive financial crisis, which has been exacerbated by the pandemic. And so for us, certainly part of the solution is to find ways to ensure that independent media have the financial support they need to be able to do their jobs. We know that when media are under financial pressure, their ability to cover events is going to be restricted. But we also may see sort of other types of effects, that media have less resources to do investigative journalism, for example, and may be more reliant on other sources of income that are not ultimately helpful. So, and at the risk of, and you also ask about the risk of amplifying fake news in the process, this is a risk, certainly, but again, for us, there's no alternative except to strengthen the types of independent quality media that can process everything that is going on right now, which is difficult, and there are no easy answers, and these are very difficult debates about how to handle the situation, what the best path forward is. So there's no, in our view, there's really no way around. There's no way around this.
And in order to protect public order and safety as a result of conspiracy theories and false alerts, do you think that some restrictions on non-conventional media be justified?
I don't know what you mean by non-conventional media, and I think it would be a very problematic approach. First of all, because obviously, I don't know if the question is more geared towards societies which already have an open media landscape and which fake news actors are more easily able to operate. But in a large chunk of countries, the problem isn't with fake news. The problem is with restrictions on media. And these types of, I don't know what it means by non-conventional media, but to sort of start restricting media on the basis of what? That would be the problem for me. What exactly would be the baseline? How would you be determining what is non-conventional media? What is fake news? This leads me back to what I was saying at the beginning, that we see states taking advantage of this crisis to push their own versions of the truth, and to cast independent media as fake news, and we see so many examples of this. So to sort of cast this as a solution, to say that certain media that are reporting in a certain way need to be restricted, I think this is hugely actually problematic, and it would send a very wrong message, I think, to governments that are well aware of the opportunities that a crisis like this offers. And again, the fake news rhetoric is the best example of that. If you look at what Russia has been doing, for example, in the past few months, using fake news, so-called fake news legislation to crack down on reporting around the pandemic. So it's not something that I would endorse. I don't think it's a good idea.
If I may add, Farid.
Yes, please.
Okay. So thank you very much. Building off what Scott Griffen just said, I think that what the pandemic has magnified is the fact that when we talk about information or freedom of expression issues, we're dealing with sort of the worst of the old problems and the new problems. The old problem is basically how different actors, particularly states, try to restrict freedom of expression. And the examples that just mentioned, that many governments, I know better the situation in Latin America, that many governments try to use sort of the problem of fake news in order to restrict freedom of expression. But that's a continuation of an old dynamics and old tendencies of many governments to actually restrict freedom of expression. That's an old problem. The new problem is what happens when the new intermediaries of public communication, particularly social media companies, operate according to principles that actually are not related to the truth, are related to financial gains, which is something that Dr. Wiggins mentioned at the very beginning, and defending certain economic decisions on the basis of, let's say, freedom of expression. When you're trying to maximize traffic and you're trying to maximize expression, the problem is that these companies are not consistent with their own guidelines in the way that they monitor speech, and they enforce their own rules. So what particularly many civil society organizations have been asking these platforms, first of all, be consistent with your own guidelines, be transparent, be accountable. Because if you really, really, really sponsor that any form of expression goes, inevitably truth suffers. And inevitably in a pandemic, public safety suffers. So what we have realized, and this is sort of my conclusion on this point, is that actually we cannot have it both ways. We cannot have a maximalist notion of expression, and at the same time, we're trying to protect public safety, we're trying to find the truth, and we're trying to find sensible policies around the pandemic and all the negative ripple effects. Why? Because this has been a natural experiment of how difficult, impossible this actually is. I'm not making an argument for regulation, but actually how we seriously consider this situation that the pandemic has revealed, that if you have more expression, we can welcome expression. On the other hand, there are some risks that we don't know how to respond to it. And actually, I think that the platforms need to think more seriously, right, in conversation with many other actors on how to respond to that problem. That expression by itself doesn't lead to truth, doesn't lead to the sensible policies we need, particularly in this moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Silvio. Now the following questions will be directed to get some recommendations and solutions. I want to ask you, Dr. Bradley Wiggins, from your academic experience, can you recommend in which direction academic research in the media field should go and which areas should be covered to contribute to more multidisciplinary and inclusive and culturally diverse media communication?
I think it's an excellent question, but I think it's probably also a work in progress. I think that with respect to the current moment with COVID, at least, which I think prompted the subject really of this panel, I think that from a purely academic point of view, I would say interdisciplinarity is probably our greatest strength. Because academics have a tendency to, maybe it's not always the case, but to sort of just stay in their offices and or areas of expertise, and they don't reach across the aisle, so to speak. I think that institutions such as ICDO does great work. More work could be done with maybe NGOs, maybe even governmental organizations, as well as other educational opportunities. For example, like the Fulbright program in the United States, or the German academic exchange program that Germany does, to sort of exchange, getting people to really experience what it's like to live in a country that doesn't have running water, perhaps, or that has, as an American citizen, I mean, I have an amazing healthcare here in Austria. A lot of my colleagues in the US, it just can't compare to what I have here in Austria. So these are just a couple of minor points, but I think that more collaboration is probably the key, and also opening dialogue with those individuals with whom we might want to disagree, instead of pointing the finger that someone says climate change is not real or whatever. Instead of mocking that point of view, inviting it in and engaging. Why do you think that way? Let's talk about it. The person who really thinks that I don't know, the Earth is flat, one of these crazy conspiracy theories, instead of calling it crazy, inviting them in and saying, well, it's a difficult subject. Let's talk it out. It's an opportunity, not necessarily an impediment to progress. It's an opportunity sometimes. It requires patience. It requires a tremendous amount of patience. And I think some planning and some strategic messaging too, I think.
Thank you, Dr. Bradley. Mr. Dragan, what can the IT sector and what can your company do to initiate and inspire any practices and initiatives to minimize the negative impact of new communication technologies in discriminatory and culturally insensitive approach to different cultures during COVID-19?
Thank you. First, I think technology is neutral, so it's neither good or bad. But people who use the technology, they are source of the problem and, of course, part of the solution. So what can we do as a company to increase usage of tech for good? I think this would be a good shape of the question. Any company, including ours, and I think it's very visible in tech sector, it starts all with clearly defined company values. So setting the right tone and language inside the company defines how company and employees behave with customers, with partners, with environment, with communities they do business and they live. And I think it's a base stuff. Second thing is definitely ensuring that the company sets even higher standards than some regulatory body asks them to do so on different topics: equality, human rights, environment, etc. Embracing sustainable development goals, for example, embracing that blueprint as part of business strategy, it fuels action for better future. And it's definitely something we all strive. Third thing, I think, is to establish ecosystem with all the organizations, NGOs, public organization, so with all eligible actors whose mission is close or aligned with the company. So this is very important to understand that only together we could do so much more. So to wrap it up, it's a repetitive process of constant action, of raising awareness on education, on promoting the right cause, and measuring the impact. I think to give maybe a wrap up, we live in ultra-connected world, and people have the right to believe and do whatever they want. They just cannot cross the line and do harm to others. So the technology can help to shape better world, but again, people are the one who will decide. I think this is the main focus. So again, technology is agnostic.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dragan. Mr. Scott, can you, from your professional experience and on behalf of the International Press Institute, reflect on the best practices and recommend any actions to be implemented to support media freedom and the improvement of journalism practices to be more inclusive toward different cultures?
Well, IPI is a network of editors and media executives and journalists. So this is a major topic of what we call the exchange through our network. And we have our network is made up of hundreds of editors and news organizations around the world that are dealing with many of these types of issues, especially now, obviously in the US following this summer's protests. So the way that we approach this issue typically is to encourage this type of exchange and learning among our networks and among our network, and to promote the sharing of strategies. And I think in the end for us, it's also about explaining to our members and encouraging our members to understand that, obviously there's a big debate right now about the newsroom diversity, ensuring that different minorities are represented in newsrooms. This is an issue in the US and Europe as well, but that it's something that matters to audiences, and it's also a way of ensuring that the news that is produced is relevant to the audiences, and audiences have become much more diverse in many of these countries, and ensuring that the newsroom reflects that is a key point for the future of the, as I said, of ensuring that the content that these newsrooms produce matters and has an impact on the public. So this is how we approach that issue. We have our World Congress going on at the moment over the next few weeks, and this is one of the key topics that we'll be discussing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Scott. Dr. Silvio, what can organizations like ICDO, International Cultural Diversity Organization, or universities do in promotion and raising awareness about human rights-based approach and inclusion of cultural diversity in media reporting, especially in such sensitive situations when minorities or marginalized groups are affected in different ways? We can hear you.
I'm sorry, I was muted. So great question. What I was saying is that what needs to be done is in some ways what many organizations have been trying to do, which is to partner with news organizations and a number of non-government organizations that actually do a lot of journalistic work in order to strengthen resources, whether it is funding resources as well as technical capacity to actually cover intercultural issues. Going back to what we said earlier, today we're dealing with one of the most formidable economic crises of news organizations around the world. And it's very difficult for a number of news organizations to have the resources, the talent, the capacity, the knowledge, the sources to do the kind of work that you're recommending in terms of how you facilitate intercultural communication or coverage of a variety of intercultural issues. It is not typically a priority for news organizations, particularly large commercial news organizations. So the question is how universities, philanthropic organizations, NGOs try to actually support that kind of work. And there are a number of very good examples, for example. And I will suggest that that is the problem, meaning we should start by understanding what are the problems that the news media have to cover the issues that you, Farid, just mentioned, rather than starting from what we believe is important. Otherwise, what typically happens, we are speaking to journalists or news organizations that do not exist, and they will not listen to us if you don't understand the specific challenges that they confront to address the kind of issues that you mentioned.
Thank you very much, Dr. Silvio. Does anyone wants to add something about anything before we close the panel? Just raise your hand if anyone wants to add something. I think oh, I'm sorry, I froze. Did anyone raise their hand?
No.
Okay. So, Josipa, please, I give you the word.
Well, we have discussed a lot in this 1 hour, and thank you for raising many topics. I think there is. Do you hear me all? I think there is much more that can be talked about regarding the topic of COVID, of the reporting, and I want to thank you all for really insights. And I wish also, as many of you pointed out, that NGOs, civil societies, media, and universities should actually cooperate between each other when this is, in this case, especially in future. I would say that in ICDO, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to talk about the issues that journalists are facing, but also that society is facing when reporting or when the topics are being discussed, which are highly sensitive. So I want to thank you all the speakers who joined us today. I wish this will raise more questions for the audience in future, to always double check the facts, to think about cultural sensitivity when writing or when reading texts, memes, or anything in the media. So thank you, Farid, for having the panel from Mexico. Thank you, everyone from US, Austria, Croatia, for being here. So I want to thank you all, and if there is anything more you want to add, please do, and have a great afternoon and evening.
Thank you, Josipa.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Nice to meet you all.
Bye-bye.
Likewise.
Likewise. Bye-bye.